It is a little weird that hot on the heels of finishing the last album, I would start work on yet another. In fact, I finished the recording of the Zealot Gene and handed everything over to the record company in around June of 2021, but the release, for reasons that we'll talk about later, wasn't until the end of January 2022, by which time I was well into the writing and preparation of this new album, RökFlöte, to give it its anglicised pronunciation. And that might seem like a little rushed. It's heading back to the territory of the 1970s, when for a while we were making a new album every year. And not that this is a habit I'm going to get back into necessarily, but it did seem a good idea to strike while the iron was at least lukewarm and plough on with another effort, because frankly I am not getting any younger, and age 75 it seems prudent to crack on rather than sit back and luxuriate in the splendours of old age, because I might not be able to do it a year or two from now. So I thought, let's get on with another thing while I'm in the mood. And indeed, being in the mood is a big part of it. The way I get into the mood is not through fantasy, imbibing substances. I get into the mood by setting myself a deadline, a starting point particularly. And as I've done with all the things I've done since Thick as a Brick 2 in 2012, I've started work at 9 a.m. on January the 1st of a new year, for no good reason other than it seems a starting point. It gives you an emotional point of reference, really, in beginning a new year with a set of hopefully fresh and productive ideas. So that's what I did this time around. On January the 1st, I went in to begin jotting down a few musical ideas, mainly as melody lines played on the flute, or on the flute family of instruments, because I played a few different flutes on this album. And it always seems like a good plan, if you have a new idea, that you try and create in parallel something that is conceptual, to base a number of ideas on and put them under that same umbrella, in terms of having a common theme fitting in to a larger scheme where those pieces of music or songs will relate to each other in some way. So that's what I found and decided upon that course of action really in the first week or two of January. So I was making pretty good headway with ideas, ready to start making demos in February of 2022. The project, the topics, and the themes were based on some initially very loose idea that I would explore the world of polytheistic belief, having not those beliefs myself. In fact, I'm not a believer as such in any faith, but I'm fascinated by the history of religion from its earliest times through to the present day, and I continue, as I have done for all of my adult life, to read about comparative religion and to study the way in which religion has developed, and how, particularly in the modern age, the role that it plays, or in some cases has ceased to play. And the idea of polytheistic faiths clearly is exemplified in the world of Hindu religion, perhaps most emphatically, where the idea that you have a number of gods and you pick your god according to some feeling that you might have of a relationship with that god and what he or she seems to represent. It may be a family tradition to follow a particular god amongst the pantheon of Hindu gods, or it may be a deliberate choice that you make somewhere along the way and as you journey through life. But that's the obvious one. I think I was looking really more at the way in which polytheistic beliefs from Greek and Roman times spread through Northern Europe and ended up, in as much as they're over and done with, apart from a few folks who like to indulge in modern play acting and I think a degree of pretense as regards following those beliefs. But it kind of ended up really in Iceland, somewhere around, I guess, around 1000 AD. We're still allowed to call it Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. That is where it really petered out. It lingered, but it was really game over around the time that the poetic Edda was written, based on the folklore and myths and legends about those gods and how they had spread through into Scandinavia and from Denmark and Sweden and Norway into Iceland. So the poetic Edda of Icelandic tradition, written in Old Icelandic, was a good starting point for me to actually go into a higher level of research, into looking into the identity of those gods and the relationship that they had with some of their precursors thousands of years before, when they first began in that tradition that led to the formation of Hinduism and a few offshoots, but then worked its way through the Germanic tribes. The German language does share some common traits with other Northern European languages, obviously, and the use of the umlaut, which we will refer to later, is an important part of that. It's become very overworked, obviously, through, amongst others, Motorhead and a number of other heavy metal bands that have chosen to employ what I once think I recall Lemmy saying in impolite reference to the Nazi dots. Again, a politically incorrect thing to have said then and certainly now, but that's what Lemmy said, and it always struck me as a bit of a parading of something in a way which I was a bit nervous about doing. But in employing those the umlaut in RökFlöte, the German pronunciation as near as I can get it of the word flute, and rock or rök being the word for destiny, for outcome, seemed like a quite a legitimate way for me to present the album. Initially, my first thought was it was an album for rock flute, as rock music, and the flute, as we know, it's spelt F-L-U-T-E. But I rather liked the other way of putting it, which seemed to have a historical and linguistic reason to be there. Some people probably won't like it. They'll think it's as gratuitous as the umlauts in Motorhead, but I think I can defend my position reasonably well on that subject. So I started off working on ideas and taking, not all, because there are a huge number of gods in the Old Norse religion, but I started off by taking a few of them that seemed to have very defined characters and personalities, roles that they played in the traditions of Norse religious belief, and they were, in some ways, they did have things in common with their ancestors in Greek and Roman times, but it was a fertile ground in lyric writing, and I decided pretty early on that I would make an album that was quite substantially instrumental, but lyrically I would confine it to a very strict practice for each song and use 6 stanzas, long stanzas, to describe the personalities and the roles of those individual Norse gods, and then to add another 4 stanzas which would explore those ideas in a much more personal way, and a way in which was up to date, or largely up to date, in terms of the world we live in today. And that I found an amusing way of giving something that was very historical and based on mythology, and to many people just a load of old cobblers. But to me, it gave it a reference point in terms of today's world and my life, because they are all subjects, those last 4 stanzas of each song. There's something in my own personal background and history that I've used as the basis for writing those down. I could go individually, song by song, through them, but I've bored you enough already. So I think we'll kind of leave it at that for now, as being the reference points that I started with and the way that it developed into the final lyrical content. All except the first and last songs, where I included in Old Icelandic the translations as best they could be done, so that our Icelandic friend and musical cohort over a number of years, Unnur Birna Bjornsdottir, would do the voiceover. She owed me a couple anyway, because I've played on tracks on her recordings in the past, as well as for her uncle's prog rock band in Reykjavik. So she was kind enough to do the voiceovers, and I used those in the first and last songs. And in the last song, actually no, in the first song, I included the English paraphrase translation of the Old Icelandic, and again in the last song, in the end of it, I again paraphrase some English language version of the last few lines, which I think for me kind of cemented it. It bookends the whole album, to start and finish it with something that is slightly mysterious and in a way delivered in the voice of the vulva, the witchy, scary seeress, the character in Icelandic mythology who tells these stories. And so in fact, when Unnur was recording it, she said, "Oh, I can't do it this week. I've got this terrible cold at the moment. I'm so croaky, and I have to wait until next week when I get better." And I said, "No, perfect. Do it now. This is the voice I want." You know, the croaky old scary woman voice. So she did it and sent it in. So going back to January and February of 2022, we didn't have an awful lot of work to do, because again, the effects of another wave of COVID had caused some further postponement of concerts initially. So there was a good time, a good window of opportunity to be able to take all of this project on to the point where I could get demos made for the band before we got too busy again, and my life tended to be limited to only 2 or 3 days back at home at any one time. So getting on with doing the demos was a curious thing, because I had all little notes on my phone, you know, just little melodic ideas, but I then had to translate those into cohesive songs, melodies, with a notion as to the chords and the arrangements. And I decided, rather than sidetrack the band by picking up the nearest acoustic guitar and strumming politely and adding some flute and vocals and things. I thought, well, let's try and keep them on the track that this is a rock album. So I purchased a compact, because it's a bit crowded around my office desk. I purchased a sawn-off Steinberger electric guitar and recorded all of the demos using an electric guitar for a change, as an indication to our guitar player Joe Parrish James as to the way that it would work. And the way that it works for me is, as a guitar player, I know there are things I can do on an acoustic guitar where the subtleties of some chords will ring true. And that's the way I chose to record it, so that I always made sure that the things that I was playing, that Joe would be able to play them that way, as well as to obviously develop things further in his own parts as we went through the process of arranging and recording the album. So there we have it. All those demos were done for 12 tracks, including what turned out to be some master flute sections and even master vocal sections. I guess probably 20% of the material on the demos, maybe higher in terms of the flute playing, actually made it onto the final master recording. Probably because I wasn't trying too hard. Maybe it just had a little emotional edge that it was good to accept the odd imperfection because it had spontaneity to it. So I did keep quite a lot of the flute in the final mix. When we did the demos, it gave the guys something like 2 months really to prepare. I refined those demos and developed the arrangements a little further during the process. So when we began rehearsing, we had complete arrangements that were, in most cases, very close to the final arrangement. And the guys had all their basic parts worked out. They'd transcribed everything and written out parts, and so we had a starting point. We had a very productive schedule of, as we did with the Zelogene, of recording immediately after doing rehearsals. So we did 2 new songs a day in rehearsals, and then we would go and record 2 songs in a studio in the southwest of England, where we stayed. I think I had maybe two days longer booked than perhaps we would need, but we ended up using those 2 days for some overdubs, and at one point I think we had not completed a second song in a given day of recording. But overall, it was something like 5 days of rehearsal and 6 days of recording that to make the whole album, as far as the band were concerned. Then I would take all of those master WAV files of the individual instruments and put them into my project on my computer, and then replace flute and vocals compared to the demo versions to whatever degree I needed to do that, and add a few other instruments. So all the time I was really working and monitoring this stuff as if it was a mix. It's the way that I like to work. I always want to hear what I'm doing as it develops, sounding like it's going to sound on the finished record. I don't know if other people work that way. I suspect that they don't, but I always like to keep building up this end result, so that the canvas is getting filled with colors and shapes and forms that are going to be there at the end. That way, when it comes to doing the final mixes, it's a question of tweaking the mix, just changing a little bit here, changing something there, finding a few technical imperfections and fixing those. But I'm well on the way to doing the final mix. So when it came to doing the final mixes, again, it was 2 a day. And when it came to mastering those in stereo, at any rate, then there was very little to change. Nick Watson is the guy who's mastered Jethro Tull and Ian Anderson records, I think, since the, well, probably in the last 20, 25 years. He, as I'm always curious to know what he does to improve upon the master mixes I've sent him, he did manage to put a little more oomph into the low end. You know, basically my mixes, I sent him what we refer to as stems, groups of instruments. So he has a little bit more fine-tuning control of groups of instruments, like all the vocals in one hit, all the flute parts in one hit, and bass and drums together, and then keyboards and guitar together. So he can fine-tune it a little bit to get the best out of each group of instruments. That way, we got a slightly heavier, more oomphy sound that I think was a definite improvement over my original master mixes when it comes to the average person hearing it on average equipment. You know, if you're listening to stuff on some super high quality system with a sub bass speakers and things, you know, you might get all of that big low end, but the average person listening on earbuds or an average stereo, you know, I think what Nick did was definitely a good emphasis that pays off for most people listening most of the time. And then we get on to the really zany subject of surround sound. When it comes to surround sound in the modern age, we're not talking about the 1970s quadraphonic, which I know a bit about and did quite a bit of back then. We're talking, in the last few years, about 5.1 surround. So you're talking about essentially 5 sources of sound, left and right behind you, left and right in front of you, a center in front of you, and a sub bass in front of you. Although that could be not necessarily directly in front of you, it could be almost anywhere. And 5.1 is the common thing to do, and obviously our surround sound mixes in recent years, many of which have been done by Stephen Wilson, are 5.1 surround. But in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly the last year or two, new, more exotic surround and fully immersive systems have come into play, probably mostly as a result of cinema, in your dedicated big modern cinema complex where you go to see the latest James Bond movie with things happening all around you and above your head and swirling around and moving. So people have got used to that degree of immersive surround sound, I think, in cinemas. And some people even have recreated that in their own domestic circumstances because they want to watch a lot of movies and they want to hear all the big stuff audio-wise. But it's crept into audio-only recording during more recent times. And I actually went to visit with our previous guitar player, Florian Opali. We went to visit a studio in Munich back in April, May, maybe even June, when it was an opportunity to go and listen to Dolby Atmos in a dedicated studio specializing in mixing and mastering in that format. And it was impressive, in some cases more so than others, depending on the musical content, because I heard some classical music, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony being rebuilt as a Dolby Atmos full surround sound experience. I have to say I didn't think that was quite as punchy as a contemporary piece of pop rock, which was much more conducive to putting things in a way that really made you feel part of, not in a sensational way, because much of what was happening behind was very discreet. It was mostly about audio ambience rather than, you know, somebody bashing a tambourine behind your right ear. It was sensitive and well done, but it was possible to do this in a way which I think definitely for a lot of people would be an added experience. And I also wanted to talk about the degree to which that added experience would be limited only to having potentially what is really 11.1 surround with 4 overhead speakers and 1, 2, 3 front speakers, sub bass, middle left and right, and behind you back left and right. All of that combined is quite an immersive thing to do when you're feeling yourself in the middle of that audio experience. But I wanted to know to what degree it might translate into simpler and more affordable sound bars, which will fire through little speakers, things that bounce off the ceiling and come down to you as if they're coming from over your head, or bounce off the walls to make you feel that you're hearing it from the sides. And also the latest generation of headphones, which will give you a pretty good semblance of Dolby Atmos surround sound to the degree that you really can tell the difference. And I know that because I did exactly that and streamed and downloaded some material from one of the usual sources online and listened back to A/B those with both the original stereo mix and the Dolby Atmos mix, so I could compare directly one and the other and see what difference there was. And it was a worthwhile difference. So that persuaded me that I should go along with the idea of doing alternative surround mixes that were more detailed for those people who have the interest and the technology to enjoy it. And then I had to find someone who could do it. So asking around with our usual record company contacts and people that come to the attention of my son James, we got in touch with Bruce Seward, the main man behind the progressive rock band The Pineapple Thief. In some way he's a contemporary really of Steven Wilson and of that modern progressive rock approach. But he had worked with his own last projects quite extensively with Dolby Atmos and had the technology and the experience to be able to do that. And because this album is released via Sony Records, Sony Music, I believe they call themselves these days, they wanted to include the Sony equivalent, which is Sony 360, which was something that Bruce was not familiar with, but he downloaded all of that stuff to work with his multi-track projects and learnt how to do that too, and engaged upon taking all of my individual track-by-track masters, which I sent to him. Took hours to upload here because I'd have a pretty awful internet connection, but eventually he got them and downloaded all of that and put them into his recording software, which is not the same as the ones I use. But he started work on that. Did a couple of little trials to see how I felt about it, and we said, we being the record company guys, and I said, well, while you're at it, Bruce, why don't you do an alternative stereo mix as well? So we've got my original stereo mix for CD and vinyl, but on the other formats or the other packaging sets where we include more in the way of DVDs and additional CDs, etc., then his stereo mixes would appear as an alternative way of looking at the music. And I know his instinct was, rather as Steven Wilson's, was to keep fairly close to the original mix. But I said to him, well, don't be afraid to strike out and make those stereo mixes maybe a little different to mine, so we get another viewpoint, another producer's way of hearing the music, not only from an oral perspective, not just sound quality, but in terms of where you might position instruments and how you might present them in terms of their individual levels within the final mix. So that was the role Bruce played, which was quite a considerable one, and he had, roughly speaking, about a month to get it done. Luckily, he wasn't on the road and was able to set aside that time. And so we pushed ahead with that, and now we have the bewildering array of products that people can buy. They've got the vinyl, they've got the stereo CD, they've got the 5.1 surround, they've got the Dolby Atmos surround, they've got the Sony 360 surround, and then they can download and stream in different resolutions, including 24-bit, the standard at which they were recorded. So there's a lot of choice out there as to how you listen to music these days, which is good, but it's also bad because it tends to be quite confusing for people, and I can only recommend that you check it out online. There's a lot of useful stuff out there in terms of describing these different technologies, how they work, and what the differences are. But a lot of people will do what I do most of the time, which is listen on headphones. And some good headphones, are going to give you a good representation, both of the surround sound and the stereo mix. Vinyl tends for most people to be the Japanese tea ceremony of the audio experience, in as much as you set aside some time, dedicate it to listening to the music, you relax, you enjoy, free of other interfering noises and confusions, and you sit down to listen to records, perhaps in a way that people did back in the 1970s. They would gather together in a room and listen in rapt attention to the latest album by Jimi Hendrix or Cream or The Who or whoever it might be. That has returned courtesy of a resurgence of interest in vinyl. And I don't choose to do that myself, but I can understand why people do it and what joy they get from handling this rather delicate vinyl product that you've got to be so careful with when you play it. But the quality these days is actually, I think, on average, much better than it was back in the 70s, partly because the mastering is more carefully done, albeit on the same 50 or 60-year-old equipment that was used back in the 60s and 70s, the Neumann cutting lathe to cut the final masters, and the pressing plants use the same traditional technology that is 50 years old. And the way in which modern ears listen to this, they are enthusiasts, they are dedicated, they are taking care, those studio technicians and mastering engineers, in a way that I don't think perhaps was often the case back in the 70s. I know, because I would be at all the cutting sessions myself when we were mastering albums and cutting some initial acetates to listen to and check through. And, I can remember being in those places, cigarette in hand with ash blowing everywhere, and generally a very polluted atmosphere, which way onto the original recording, because there would be little clicks and noises due to the fact there was a lot of particulate matter from heavy cigarette smoking in the same little studio, probably with no ventilation. And mentioning no names, the cutting engineer I most often work with not only managed to infiltrate master recordings with his cigarette habit on Jethro Tull records, but probably all of Led Zeppelin's catalogue as well. If you hear the odd little noise, it's probably cigarette ash and smoke getting in the grooves. However, that's part of the folklore of those early days. These days, I really do think vinyl is a much better experience than it ever was, and you get a much, much closer result in terms of comparing it to 24-bit master technology audio in the digital domain. So vinyl is pretty good these days, as long as you've got a good record player and a good clean new needle stylus. Sorry. So that's the vinyl thing, and the only bugbear is that everything is held up, as it was with the Zealot Gene. We had to wait from June until the end of January to get vinyl pressed and manufactured. A long queue to wait your turn to get things done and manufactured, because there are so few pressing plants left in the world these days, that everybody wants to have a vinyl release, and frankly the facilities are not there as they were in the 70s. Most places have long since vanished. This time around we pre-booked the slot, so the year that other people are being quoted right now for waiting time to get vinyl released, we were able to effectively still deliver an album in October of last year, 2022, in time for an end of April release in 2023. So we did shorten the waiting list time quite a bit, and hopefully it's worth waiting for those enthusiasts, because no record companies want to release CDs now and then surround sound a bit later and then vinyl 6 months after that. Everybody wants to have a coterminous point of finishing everything, getting it out there into the world. So we have to wait for vinyl, and hopefully for a lot of people it's worth waiting for. When we got to the finishing point, I suppose, in recording at least the backing tracks, I was already beginning to put together some ideas for how this would look in terms of album covers and the different packages, because of course with basic CD something has to work at this scale, whereas on the Super Deluxe package you're talking about a big box set essentially with lots of different contents and bigger booklet and bigger scale everything, as you do with a vinyl record. So it's got to be artwork that will work at different scales, which includes obviously the text too, because it might be very readable on the back of a vinyl or in a vinyl booklet. But when you can scale that down to CD, then it's a extra strong reading glasses for most of us. You've got to be careful about it. I tried to think about these things ahead of time, and had already compiled, apart from the lyrics, had already started to compile some descriptive text about making the album, and the background to the album as a project and its concept. So a lot of it was already in a not final, but advanced state of preparation to be able to finally edit it and do the obvious corrections and fix a few typos and send that off to the art and design person in Germany who was doing this for us. I was saying, but I did the Zealot Gene stuff. And my notion for a central image was trying to tie together the words rock flute and to look at some of the traditions of the earliest depictions in artwork terms of prehistoric art. There's a huge amount of cave painting in evidence around the world, but they're different cultures, they're different backgrounds, they're different topics, different subjects. I wanted something that was a little closer to the Scandinavian, the geographical relevance. And so I found examples not of cave paintings but of rock engravings called petroglyphs around in parts of Sweden, particularly near a small town called Tanum in Sweden. And those were intriguing because they included, which are fairly rare in early prehistoric art, to show human forms. And they did. So I based my first notions around the petroglyphs of Tanum. Now they are outdoors, not in a cave. They are on rock surfaces, hard rock, chiseled in to a depth of maybe anything from 2 millimeters to a centimeter, dug out as engravings, if you like, in the rock. And then they may well have been back then filled with paint to make them stand out visibly from the rock. That will have long since disappeared, and so they have been more recently and controversially refilled by the custodians of that artwork to make them visible and usually roofed over to protect them from acid rain and the elements generally. So they have a kind of reddish brown appearance, and some of them I actually did consider using in the album artwork, and these are some examples of the petroglyphs of Tannum, and they have male and female forms, which are kind of very simple stick figures, really. And so I thought, well, none of them clearly would have one-legged flute players in them, but I thought, well, let's take the long-standing Tull logo of the one-legged flute player and give that some context. So I started off with a couple of crayon drawings of the one-legged flute player, with a notion that I would actually paint these onto some rock surfaces in our gardens around here where I live. But it was raining all the time. So I decided I would have to photograph the rock surfaces when they were dry, and then we would have to superimpose them digitally later. So I ended up with, I suppose, my kind of final drawing, painting stick figure was this one, which was then photographed and turned into the master art that went off to be included as images on the front and back of the album cover. I was wandering around here a few weeks ago thinking I need some rocks, and looking at all these beautiful stones that had been cut many, many years ago to put in these ornamental walks. Anybody like plums, by the way? Take as many as you can. There are lots and lots of different rocks, and I don't know where they came from, where they were quarried. Perhaps in Wales. But I figured I was going to try. I think this was my rock, and you can see, if you look very carefully, you'll actually see a badly crayoned little attempt to see what a figure would look like if painted onto the rock. And remarkably, I suppose because we haven't had very much rain, it's still there. So the idea was taking that as a way of making an image for the album, but as I said, it was too complicated, so I ended up just photographing chunks of rock in various places. I remember this guy, and using those as layers for the artwork and the pages behind the text, where we could continue with the rock, not rock music, but rock chunk of stone. And that was really a starting point, and where I like playing with words. It's what I do for a living. Even if I sometimes lose, it's still good fun. Did think about having, apart from the central figure, having some other figures that were either recreations of the Tannum figures, or indeed maybe actually using the Tannum figures themselves. I think what put me off that idea was that it became too bitty, having lots of little stick figures in the context of the album cover. It seemed to focus better just using a single image, and that was that was how this figure came about. I did slightly edit it and redo it in terms of the final version, but one thing that is very common when human figures are found either in cave paintings or in petroglyphs, engravings, is they have a very high opinion of their manhood, and so they're usually given huge penises. I mean, huge big penises. The record company felt that was maybe a little inappropriate. my wife thought it was even more inappropriate, so I decided, well, I'll just have a little kind of stubby little guy here, just something that suggests it without being too much. But it was too much for my wife. She said, I think it's got to go. And so I slightly rounded it off to be no more intrusive than the average male ballet dancer in tights. So I think I got away with it. Nobody said, we have to sticker the artwork to pass muster with the censors and the powers that be. So we got away with just a little kind of stubby, lumpy little thing suggestion there. So it's not an accurate depiction historically or artistically of prehistoric artwork. It's just having a little fun with the idea, like having a little fun with the umlaut and having a little fun with rock, spelled R-O-C-K, versus rock, rök, destiny, outcome in Old Icelandic. These are things that I suppose mark for me what making music is really about. It may have a whole lot of serious thought and consideration, analysis, research that goes behind it. But at the end of it, you're going to listen to it once or twice and toss it aside. It's got to be about having fun, both for me as a writer and for you as a listener. If it's not fun, it's not worth the light. As always, when you finish making a record, you tend to go through a little period where you put it out of your mind, put it behind you. Just let the dust settle, intellectually and physically. And then weeks or months later, you're faced with that inevitable decision. Are we going to play this live on stage? And if so, how much of it? With the Zealot gene and the fact that after 53 years of traveling about, making records and touring, there's a whole bunch of stuff that people rightfully expect to hear, and I expect to play in a set list, which is going to inevitably consist of many of the classic Jethro Tull songs in the repertoire over the years. So maybe there's room for 2 or 3 songs from a new album. And with the Zealot gene, we've been playing in 2022, been playing 3 songs from the Zealot gene album, which were chosen, I suppose, because they were more fitting alongside the range of music. They fitted into the more of the progressive rock terminology, since the tours were called Jethro Tull, the prog years, was the way they were billed, going back to 2019, in fact, when we started selling tickets for those tours, most of which, of course, were inevitably postponed and delayed for 2 years or more before we finally got round to being able to do them all. So we were picking the songs that were progressive rock. This album is very much progressive rock, but with a lot of, I suppose, classical overtones to the way that it's constructed and some of the musical lines. A little bit of a folky thing happens once or twice. But generally speaking, it's progressive rock music. And my gut feeling is we will have 2 or 3 songs from this new album included in the set list for 2023. But at the time of recording this video, I can't tell you which ones they'll be. I have to run that by the other guys in the band and find out what they would have fun with. What would be, what are they looking forward to playing live on stage? And we will probably be in close agreement, I should think, with a final choice. But at the end of it all, it's the final proof to be able to take something from an initial idea to a rehearsed and arranged idea to a piece of recorded product, mixed and mastered. The last part of the jigsaw puzzle that you pop into place is the live performance. And that is where it all begins in terms of the music recording experience, because we play it all in the studio like it's going to be played live. You know, the guys are all together, playing in real time, playing the arrangement as it would be live on stage. So it's usually not a big job to recreate that finally as a live show. And I think we'll be in agreement. I think we'll have little difficulty in picking up the pieces again months later and spending an hour or two remembering all the parts and being able to go in to have a quick rehearsal. Maybe a sound check before a show is all we'll need, because we tend to do our homework before we actually risk embarrassing ourselves in the finals of the school exams, which is when the audience walk in and judge us. So we'll be in good shape. We'll be in good shape. It's always difficult to know in advance how other people are going to perceive your work, whether it's the other guys in the band listening to the final mixes, and I'm sure having some thoughts of their own. Well, I wish he'd done that, or I wish he'd turned that up or turned that down, whatever it might be. It's always difficult to know how people are going to perceive it. And I have to just go with my own notion, you know, my own sense of what I have fun with and how I enjoy it, and hope that other people will too. Because I don't like to be too self-conscious about writing music in order to be popular. I've done that a few times in my life and mostly failed in the process. Once or twice I might have accidentally got it right, but you know, if I'm consciously trying to write to please people, it's most likely going to go wrong. So I just follow my nose and do what I think is fun for me and enjoyable for me in the process of making the record. But my hope would be, not an expectation, but my hope would be that people will listen to this album, and above all, they will see some continuity. They'll see some little elements there that go back to the very beginning, rhythmically or melodically. They'll hear little notions that are lyrically, oh yes, he's touched upon that idea before. And I think continuity is really important, especially when you get to my age, that you've got a legacy, you've got something sitting behind you in a historical perspective that for a lot of people is more contemporary than it is for me, because they still listen to that music, whereas I probably only play some of it live on stage. So there'll be a lot of people who will be more familiar with the whole history of Jethro Tull, who will probably derive, I hope, a pleasurable experience from listening to this record. I hope they will find lots of little places where they can say, that's Jethro Tull. Even if, as we all know, there have been 28 members of Jethro Tull over the years, and actually 29 if we include Jack Clark, who had to stand in for David Goodyear a couple of times in 2022. Then there are a lot of changes along the way, but I think you'll hear in the guitar playing by Joe Parrish James, you will hear echoes of Florian Opali, and in that you would hear echoes of Martin Barre. And even going back, you'll hear in Martin's original recordings echoes of Mick Abrahams, who played with Jethro Tull for the first 8 months. So I think continuity is the most important thing, and that's what I hope people will come to, even if they don't rationalize it or think about it as an intellectual proposition. I hope they feel the continuity in their gut. You know, I hope they just get that gut resonance of something that sounds familiar but different. So that's it, familiar but different. We made a few records in my own studio here at home, and they were made in their entirety, right through to the final mixes. But More recently, I tend to use the studio for rehearsal rather than recording, trying to be a recording engineer, a record producer, and a musician, a performing musician, all at the same time is really, well, virtually impossible. So these days we do the rehearsals for live concerts and new material, new songs for recording. We do all that here in the rehearsal room. But I think I started back at the time of doing Thick as a Brick 2, of just taking my recording microphone into another quiet room in the house with a laptop running the same programs and having the master recordings on, and doing overdubs of flute and vocal in a bedroom somewhere. These days I tend to do it at my office desk because my usual microphone is sitting there at all times, whether I'm doing a Zoom call interview with the media or doing some promo recordings or for radio or television, whatever it might be. So it's always there. It's just press a button and go. And it's a lot easier for me to work that way. I share an office with my wife. So there are times when I have to wait while she's having a coffee break in order to nail the master vocal and get it finished before she comes back in again. And apart from the annoyance of hearing me warbling or playing the flute from the other side of an office room, it's clearly she makes any kind of a noise, even tapping on her keyboard of the computer, it could get picked up on the master recording. So we have to take it in turns. But practically speaking, I do most of my work, whether it's playing guitar or playing the flutes or singing, I do it at my office desk these days, and then mix the whole album sitting at my office desk. There's little point in going out to the studio, which is, 60, 70 meters away, and unlocking it, and I have to remember to put the heating on, and sitting in a rather lonely, empty room doing something that I can do that is only 20 paces from the coffee machine in the kitchen. It's definitely an attraction. So the way we are in state-of-the-art recording these days, it isn't so much about making a record in your bedroom. It's about making a record in your office. And same deal at the end of the day. It's just about the quality of the microphone you use. And I have a great microphone that I like to work with, where I'm usually, I guess, probably singing about maybe 20 centimeters away from the microphone, and I don't have to do anything. I don't have to add any EQ, or it's going to sound very natural just the way it is. Same thing applies to playing the flute. So it's nice to know that you don't have to do stuff. The quality of the microphone is a very neutral one, and it's a great starting point. You'll learn more about that if you read some of the text material included in this album in the booklets. But the flutes that I play are most often the concert flute, the traditional classical music orchestral concert flute in the key of C. And I also have owned at different times an alto flute, which is the big cousin, I suppose, is the cello to the violin in terms of making a reference point. And there sits somewhere between the cello and the violin, there sits the viola. And the flute equivalent of the viola is the flute d'amour, which is pitched a little lower than the concert flute, so it's a bigger instrument, but not nearly as big as the alto flute. And I use those for the most part on this recording, mostly concert flute, but quite a bit of alto flute and some flute d'amour. I had it in mind to include some piccolo, but I ended up playing the Irish whistle instead of the piccolo, because the two places I used it, I wanted a little bit more of a folky feel rather than the shrill classical piccolo. So there we have the flute family members that I ended up using. And they are very different, particularly the alto flute, which you will recognize from a very deep, sonorous tone. The one that I had and have had since the early 1990s, I swapped for a new one, which is a straight alto flute, big, cumbersome thing to play, as opposed to the one I had, which had a curved head joint, so it was easier to play. Intonation wasn't so good, and really the big old straight line alto flute is for me the better instrument, at least in a recording context. But I'm not sure that I want to lug one of those things around through airport security on a regular basis. So whether it finds its way into a live performance is yet to be seen. But I do like the alto. My personal favorite is the flute d'Amour, which is just slightly more of a rounded, velvety sound compared to the concert flute. And it only has, effectively, it's only 2 or 3 notes different in terms of the pitch of the instrument, but the tonal quality of it, because it's got a larger bore, bigger head joint, it has a definite character of its own. And, a good flute d'Amour player, of which there are very few, bad ones or good ones, will probably make his instrument sound, or her instrument sound, like a concert flute to a large degree, and vice versa. A good concert flute player will cover most of the range of the flute d'Amour and can endow it with that more sonorous quality of tone. But I'm not that good. I actually need a different instrument if I want to explore the nuances sonically of those different instruments. But I've always loved the flute d'Amour, apart from the name, flute d'Amour en français, but flauto d'amore in Italian. Goodness knows what it is in Old Icelandic, but it's probably impronounceable and has several umlauts. It's a good, fun thing to play because it's not too big and heavy to hold, but has that wonderful quality of sound that makes me take it out to play with and practice with it, even when I have nothing in the current repertoire that I would use. As a live performance repertoire, nothing that I would use it for. But who knows, that might change with the live performance of some of these new album tracks. We'll see. But I love my flutes, and I set out to make an album that was heavy on flute, and that's the way that it turned out. I hope it isn't too annoying for people to hear so much flute, because in Jethro Tull music historically it was there a lot of the time, but quite often a lot of well-known Jethro Tull music did not contain any or very much flute at all. Here you can't escape it. It's the lead instrument through much of the recording, and indeed some of the original flute was replaced not only by guitar solos and keyboard solos for musical purposes to give more of an involvement with the final result. So the delete button came into play a few times there, giving things over to the other guys to play, but also even in terms of the vocals, because I had set out to demonstrate the melody lines that would be vocal by playing flute lines before I recorded some rough vocals, very rough vocals for the guys to hear. But sometimes I kept a flute playing the vocal line in the background just to remind myself, when it came to doing the master vocals, what it was I was intending to sing. And some of it's actually quite hard to sing, because when you work out a line that makes sense on the flute, it doesn't necessarily translate into the human voice. It can be quite difficult. And, maybe for a trained opera singer, some of the intervals and some of the musical ideas would be things they could read off the page and learn and memorize and sing. But for the average rock singer, I think some of it would be quite tricky to do. For me, it's tricky to do, but I'm the guy who wrote it, so ultimately I only have myself to blame. And I have myself to consult with when it comes to tweaking a melody a little bit to make it sing better and more easily, and sometimes more expressively, because when you want to try and put some expression into what you're singing, you've got to have the latitude to do that and not necessarily be worrying only about the physical accuracy of hitting a given note. You want to be able to play with a little bit in emotional terms. So It has to be about the sense of fun. The fun that got me into music in the first place, that brought me into it, and the fun that will ease me back out of it at some point when the Grim Reaper comes to call.